saying, in the decade after 2000, some major new amenities entered Dhantala again. Among these, satellite television, mobile phones, and a slew of welfare schemes like the employment guarantee scheme, the right to food, leading to much cheaper rations, right to education, bringing in a two. There are four middle schools actually now. Two are in private sector and two of the government schools. And after 2014, a very major improvement has come in the terms of regular power supply. Earlier, the village rarely had more than 12 to 14 hours of electricity in a day. Now, the duration has improved to about 20 hours daily. And more than that, power supply is more reliable now. And if there are any snags, they are corrected more quickly rather than waiting for weeks, as was the norm earlier. Also, the large-scale construction of toilets, houses, free distribution of gas cylinders, and also opening of bank accounts for most families. These have been the major improvements after 2014 with the coming of the Modi government. Still, the village lacks water supply in homes, also big lack of cold storage facilities which can prevent wastage of food crops, etc. And dispensary has opened only this week in the village, which is a very happy news, although it was pending for a long time. Now, this is the brief history of the growth of amenities in the village. Now, as I said, now we turn to the discussion of the social structure. And in this, I will be running over the major groupings to come to class for a more detailed discussion. About village as a community, the only point I would like to make is that the village rarely meets for its Gram Sabha also. Although village has a strong sense of identity, it has elected Panchayat and Pradhan now, but the Gram Sabha rarely meets, and that's a major lack. There's some snag with my screen is not. Can you see the slides?
No, sir. We can only see you right now.
I don't know what is the.
When you take your time, sir, I will remove this thing. Now we can see the screen, but not you. Now both we can see.
Yeah. So we were
horizontal outlook would be better. If you
yeah. Sorry, I forgot. Regarding caste, I would just mention one major point which is often ignored is that overt discrimination has come down, but covert discrimination definitely remains. But this discrimination and hierarchy is present also within Dalit caste. This point is often ignored. For example, Valmikis and Jatavs don't intermarry generally and don't vote along similar lines. More significantly, they have a sense of hierarchy among themselves also. And Valmikis are seen as inferior by many Jatavs. Although, as I said, covert discrimination has come down. The village has about 15 odd Muslim families, but there has never been any violence along religious lines. But in surrounding cities as well as some villages, violence has been there. Uh, uh, Now we come to the category within social structure to which I wish to give some more time. What are the relations between classes in the village? And do they correspond to the Marxist uh, perspective on Indian social structure? See, the families in Dhantala can be clubbed into, as I said, uh, three broad classes, each of which has two layers. I have already described the absentee landlord uh, and rich peasants on the top, now joined by some formal sector employees and a rural bourgeoisie or professionals like lawyers, etc., as well as some shopkeepers who form the second layer within the elite of the village. The middle order of the village consists of peasants and artisans, uh, and there used to be the Jajmani relation between these two segments, whereby the artisans were attached to some landowning families, uh, uh, and they were paid, and this attachment was on a hereditary basis, and payment to the artisans for their services was generally in kind at the time of the harvest. This was the Jajmani system, and there used to be a considerable degree of loyalty between Jajmans and what were called Kamins or their uh, servicing families. Now, this Jajmani system has completely disappeared over time, especially from about 1980s when cash transactions grew, and also when in 1990s, as I said, migration of families from the village started. The Jajmani relations completely broke down. Also, after the independence, I said tenants had become landowners with the abolition of zamindari, and the tax that they had to pay to the government also practically became negligible. In fact, the tax rate at the moment given to the state only by those who hold more than 15 acres of land is rupees 75 per acre per annum, which is a very, very small amount, as the average net earning from about 1 acre in good harvests, which are generally 2 to 3 harvests in a year, is about 50,000 to 1 lakh from 1 acre for a family. So, given that the tax rate is very low, the artisans are supposed to have declined in a big way under colonial rule. But actually, in Dhantala, we see that except for weavers, the decline of potters, carpenters, etc., was not dramatic at all. It has been a very slow process, and actually more so after independence. And in their place, however, lots of new service providers have now appeared, like drivers, etc., who commute daily to the cities, and even within the village, the repair shops for mobile phones, etc., are have emerged from the old artisan castes, especially which are Kumhars and Muslims. Uh, Among the lower order of the village, the laboring classes, farm and non-farm workers, Again, there has been a major change with the increase in rate of migration. The wages have risen considerably. As I said, they have roughly doubled in the last 30 years. Uh, Tirthankar Roy has in fact estimated that the real wage doubled in 200 years between 1750 and 1950, roughly. And now we are seeing the same rise in about 30 years. Especially this has, of course, as I said, happened after the liberalization of the economy. What about the relation between caste and class? There used to be a strong overlap till about 1970s between castes and classes. For example, on the top, there were no upper castes, of course. There was only one Brahmin family and one Banya family. The Brahmin family was actually very poor, and the Banya family didn't have much power in the village, and they could not retrieve their loans, and they also left. Uh, on the other hand, the absentee landlord were the Ashraf Muslims, and their agents were the rich Gurjars. The middle order of peasants and artisans were again OBC castes, or what we should better call middle castes, the Gurjars, Jats, Kumhars, and Muslims. And the lower order again had a very major overlap with the Dalit castes. But these overlaps have diminished considerably over time. And now, for example, Dalit families also own land, and some of them also are a part of the village elite of lawyers, teachers, etc., who have taken benefit of the reservation system, and also by their hard work in education, etc., they have been able to breach the barrier with the elites. And I personally saw even the upper caste now sit, for example, in meetings in the homes of the rich Dalit lawyer or the rich Dalit teacher, etc. So that has, and the last breach perhaps has been that now even upper castes are applying for sweepers jobs in the government sector. This is the perhaps the turnaround in the caste-class relation. Some scholars have said that we should look at not classes within the village, but village itself as a class as against the city and the state. The advocates of this proposition have been both politicians and scholars. Chaudhry Charan Singh, Mahinder Singh Tikat, Sharad Joshi of Maharashtra, and scholars like Gail Ombet and Yogendra Yadav recently have seemed to suggest this as the major division in Indian society, the city versus the village, or at least the farmers versus the state. Because within the village, the economic and political interests of the farmers and non-farmers do not overlap or coincide. But then even the farmers' movements against the state, as the one that is continuing at the moment around Delhi, also doesn't seem to have taken off in a big way, because the interests of the rich peasants and the poor peasants don't coincide. The richer agricultural tracts like Punjab and Haryana, as opposed to poorer tracts like Bihar and Odisha, don't overlap. Also, farmers tend to have multiple identities, especially their caste and religious identities are also strong. Therefore, their mobilization as farmers primarily is not easy. Another reason is that the state is actually a major benefactor of the agriculturalists today. And the battle is only over the degree of subsidies that the farmers demand from the state. Uh, and the state is not extracting, like the pre-modern state, any surplus from the farmers. Uh, Rather, its failure to serve the farmer as a citizen lies in the fact that the infrastructure in villages is very poor, as the quality of public services is extremely poor, and rural industrialization has failed to take off, leading to major underemployment of farmers whose fields have shrunk, machines have entered in a big way, and mechanized agriculture doesn't demand that much of labor. So most people in villages are extremely underemployed, and this is the failure of the state. Unfortunately, this failure has less been in focus in the farmers' demands, and more populist ones like greater price support for farm produce, etc., have dominated. Another reason why the battle between farmers and city seems not very sturdy is the fact that farmers' sons don't want to remain either in farming or in villages. They want to become city dwellers. So the war between farmers and state should cannot be seen as uh, uh, a long-lasting battle or a very critical issue uh, in this light. So our evidence from Dhantala on class relations suggests that the Marxist perspective doesn't help us very far. Obviously, revolutionary class struggles have not developed, uh, but the bigger failure of Marxism in understanding rural social structure seems to lie in the fact that their understanding of the ruling class as well as the proletariat seems far from reality. There is no unified ruling class, and the interests of bureaucrats, for example, versus capitalists versus landowners are not only different but contradictory at times. So there is no single ruling class, rather, there are competing elites in the sense that Pareto suggested. Uh, Also, the Marxist perspective seems to have ignored the fact that the intelligentsia is a dominant partner in the ruling class. It's not just landowners and capitalists on whom they often dwell or target, but intelligentsia itself, the bureaucracy, the journalists, the academics, etc., are a major partner on the ruling class. Similarly, the dominant Marxist understanding of the have-nots or the proletariat also seems wanting in light of our research. The reason being that the Marxists often tended to focus on the industrial working class as the major component of the proletariat. But from the perspective of the small peasant and the petty vendor, who doesn't have any security, any pension, any medical benefit, etc., to fall back on. The industrial working class, which has jobs in the formal sector and therefore has some of these social security benefits and monthly wage, uh, they seem like some kind of a semi-elite to the informal sector worker. And this point needs emphasis in a setting like Indian village. Uh, Secondly, as I had said, even below the informal sector worker or laborer, there are the real have-nots of beggars, of the petty vendor, or who cannot go to sit even on the street but just remains confined to the entry of her house to sell petty uh, um, things, etc. So, this is the real underclass that cannot even labor because of health reasons or age X factor, etc., which should be seen as the real proletariat, unlike what Marxist analysts often seem to suggest. Another reason why Marxist perspective doesn't seem valid in light of our evidence is that obviously polarization is not happening. The state has introduced laws which has uh, made the economic life of the landless slightly better, and this introduction of ceilings on landholding, etc., has not allowed uh, the appropriation of petty holdings by richer farmers and so on. Obviously, there is little capitalist farming in villages, and it is the middle peasantry that dominates, uh, including the fact that numerical dominance also plays a major role in economic as well as social security of concerned families. In this light, we see that class consciousness and conflicts have not risen to the extent that some, especially Maoists, etc., were expecting. But the incident of 1984 that I reported about the successful redistribution of land to the landless in Dhantala suggests that class consciousness remains a potential consciousness, and class conflicts are not entirely absent. Uh, but the biggest flaw in Marxism emerges from the fact that it looks at exploitation as its major concern rather than suffering in a broader sense. As I said, suffering arises from illness, from lack of literacy, from poor state of public services, etc., and pollution and contaminated food chain, etc. And these can be addressed only through better governance rather than revolutionary class struggles or creation of a classless society by itself. This raises a very interesting question. Why did Marxism attract such brilliant scholars and artists and activists, etc., all over the world, in fact? And several reasons can be suggested for this. Of course, Marxism's overt aim for standing for the downtrodden attracts intellect, obviously, but also the intellectual's passion for power and the Lenin's dreams of capturing power through not reform but revolution rising on the backdrop of a chaos uh, seems to have been a reason for many brilliant minds uh, having been attracted to Marxism. I must also mention at this point that Nobel laureates like Amartya Sen, who departed from Marxism to espouse welfarism, also are shown as limited in their perspective from our Dhantala evidence, uh, uh, especially by showing that Sanian welfarism, although has expanded the notion of development by linking it to capabilities, but its overwhelming stress has been on expansion of health infrastructure, education infrastructure, etc. Yet, just by increasing the number of teachers, improving their salaries, building more schools and classrooms, etc., in the absence of work discipline doesn't do any good. This has been a clear experience in Dhantala. because here, as I saw, even poor laborers are sending their children to private schools rather than the government school, which doesn't charge any fee and gives midday meal, free dress, etc. Yet they send them to private school where rupees 200 odd are taken per student per month, because the quality of teaching in the village school run by the government is extremely poor. So this aspect of governance reforms needs to be kept in mind. I've already explained the decline of Jajmani. About family, I would only like to mention that while joint kitchen and joint housing have declined, but the support between nuclear families belonging to same joint family continues in a major way, and even this extends to the fact that the gotra of or a collective of joint families doesn't allow marriage between youngsters belonging to same gotra. In fact, such alliances can be even punished by the community by uh, ostracism and even by death at times. So this is taken very seriously in the village. Uh, about the position of women, I'll just mention that literacy, education of girls, etc., has improved in a big way. But the burden of work on village women is extreme, and from making dung cakes and cooking over mud chulas to fetching water in pitchers, etc. Even in rich families, better off families of Dhantala, women do most work, both uh, in domestic work, kitchen work, but also cattle rearing, etc., from morning to evening. Uh, uh, However, positive on the positive side, female feticide has come down, and the sex ratio has improved visibly.
So, sir, let's take an